A little caveat about this, Pratima and I, we're not developers, we're security people. But ultimately, one of kind of my day jobs at AWS as a specialist SA is to create a demo environment and have a ready-to-go demo environment for the generalist SAs out there, the security SAs around the world. So that involves creating tons of resources and breaking things and creating GuardDuty findings. And frankly, that took a lot of time a couple years ago. We've been able to speed a lot of that up with Q Developer. So we're going to go through some of that today, also talk about why you would do it, talk about how can you do remediation and how as a security professional, even if you're not a developer like ourselves, you can use some of this technology to create better outcomes in your role. So if you are a developer, please don't cringe or yell at me when I do weird things that are probably not best practices. So first, we're going to start with a service overview. What are the different services that we're going to be talking about? Hopefully everyone's somewhat aware, but let's talk about it a little bit more. How can you configure Q Developer? Pretty straightforward. And then we're going to walk through demos most of the time. It's going to be GuardDuty finding creations, remediation walkthrough. I forgot to update the agenda, but we're going to go through some vulnerability recommendations and remediations. And then we'll talk about key takeaways. And after that, we're going to go to Herschel's and get pastrami Rachel's, which are amazing. OK, so let's get started with GuardDuty is the first thing we're going to talk about. If you're not too familiar with GuardDuty, it's AWS threat detection service that it does a couple different things. So at a foundational layer, we collect data from AWS environments. So what we call our foundational data sources is CloudTrail, VPC flow logs, and DNS logs. We collect this service-to-service communication, so it's not anything a customer has to turn on in their environment. Whether you have 5, 50, 5,000 accounts, it doesn't really matter. We collect all this data and abstract that heavy lifting from the customer. Over the years, we've expanded into more data sources. More data sources, the more we can detect, the more insight we have into an environment to understand where threats might be happening. So where we've expanded to is S3 data events, so we can see the reads and writes of S3 data and see when there might be malicious activity. EKS audit logs, that's the control plane level activity for Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service. Amazon Aurora login events, Lambda network activity, and then we have runtime activity as well for EC2, EKS, and ECS, the Elastic Container Service from AWS. And then we also have the ability to scan for malware in EBS volumes as well as S3, where a lot of customers might have an S3 bucket where they have untrusted uploads and they need to verify that those files don't have malware in them before they kind of move them into their application workflow. We create findings based on either threat intelligence and machine learning, and then integrate these finding capabilities or these findings into a number of different services, whether that's Security Hub, where we contextualize some of that with Inspector and Security Hub data, if you saw the announcement yesterday, and then or Amazon Event Bridge, where a lot of customers create remediation workflows or integrations with ticketing systems, and then also integrating with Amazon Detective for root cause analysis and resource relationships. So speaking about announcements, I want to make sure that people are aware of this. Amazon GuardDuty Extended Threat Detection. We announced another extension to this yesterday. This is really just a finding type that happens in GuardDuty. It's not anything a customer has to turn on. If you're using EKS protection from GuardDuty, you get this automatically. So it's not something that costs money. It's not something you have to turn on. But essentially the way that this works is previously you might have had a GuardDuty finding for an enumeration activity, an exfiltration activity, an impact type of tactic. They would be different GuardDuty findings. I would say somebody's scanning your environment, someone's got crypto mining on this, someone's destroying something. Now with this extended threat detection, we create attack sequence findings that bring all these kind of signals together and say here is the extent of your security issue, right? They started here, went here, ended up here, and ultimately, this is the whole security issue. So bringing a lot more context and correlation together for our customers. So with that said, I'll pass it over to Pratima.
How many of us have heard about Q Developer or Q at all? Do you use it? Have you tried any bits and pieces of it? Okay, so you have heard about it, right? And the rest of you have heard about the general term generative AI? Yes? Okay.
This is a code talk, so
yeah, it has
it's meant to be interactive.
Yeah. You guys don't speak up. I'm going to take all the Tim Tams away. So yeah, okay. So Q Developer is a specialized tool that uses generative AI models under the hood. It's a massive agentic. Amazon Q as such is a massive agentic system under the hood. So when you use Q Business or Q Developer or Q with QuickSight, it's using multiple sets of agents to get the right model doing the right thing to get you the most appropriate answer, right? So you don't have to build that system yourself. You can use Q Developer. If you're like me, if I had to code, probably I'd be out of a job because I don't know how to. So Q Developer has been very useful. The other thing that it's useful for is when you're writing massive code, or maybe you're in a business where you've acquired another company and you've got a bunch of code that you need to now integrate with your systems. You need to write tests, right? So you can just throw Q Developer on top and say, write me tests for this entire code base. And it will make an attempt to do it. It'll read through it. It'll do it. Now, the one thing we need to keep in mind is with generative AI, like as much as we love the amount of capability it gives us, that human intervention or human supervision is really required. It'll get you kickstarted like super quick, but then make sure that whatever it's doing, at any point of time, it's not getting confused. And for that, your prompts need to be slightly more descriptive so that the model really has the context of what it's going to do. The one other thing that I'm very bad at is I love doing security things. I love telling my customers, look, this is what you can do, but they want documents. They want, can you document this so that we can make it a business case and present it to our team? Or we can showcase that this is what the architecture diagram looks like. So as much as I want to go into PowerPoint, pick the right, icons and stitch it up all together, I could use Q Developer, and I'll show you in a bit as well, is to build a markdown, and it prints out pretty boxes and does all the arrows and things, and I'm like, that's so much work that I don't have to do, that I don't like to do, but I have to do as a part of my job. So it really is that assistant or that augmenting function for my role, so I'm not necessarily wasting time in all of these things that I don't want to do, but I'm thinking more about what my customers benefit from. And when I tell Q, it kind of tries to think like me and builds out the artifacts for me. Now, if you were to integrate Q in your environment, you would be doing that through IAM Identity Center and surfacing Q as an application. Can someone tell me why? Why should I be using IAM Identity Center with it? Like, what capability is Identity Center giving me?
Is that a hand?
Access to the right data sources that correspond to your user type.
Right, yeah, so permissions control. What else? From the context of generative AI, what else do you think Identity Center adds to the experience?
There's another hand here.
I was just going to say, you can also sync it up with your current, either Azure Active Directory.
Yeah.
Make sure that you have an SSO that can.
Yep, single sign-on. Yep. Anyone else? Now think about Amazon Q as an application that's surfaced through Identity Center. What it gives you is, as soon as the user enters through Identity Center and accesses the application, it preserves the context of that user. So now my business could have 20 people talking to Q, but I go in as Pratima, and it knows that Pratima talked to me about these different things. This is probably what she wants to talk to me about as well. So it gives you a personalized experience, which is quite powerful, because every human is bespoke, right? Our interpretation of, each of us have a different interpretation, slightly different for different things. Even if we do the same job, we think slightly differently. So it builds that context space within that Q business application or Q developer application so that it works according to its thinking. It starts thinking like I am thinking. So it becomes more of my sort of, assistant, or more of my, for the lack of a better word, like a pilot that's next to me. That's the primary use case when you say I want to use Identity Center with Q Business and Q Developer. From there, we will now move to a little bit of demo. We are going to be flip-flopping between 2 laptops, so there'll be moments of silence when we do that, but you can crack a joke while we're at it if you want to kill the silence. And over to Marshall.
Cool. So we have come out with our GuardDuty tester open source repo. So essentially, it looks like this. It deploys a bunch of resources. It's a CDK project, and folks can put this into a sandbox environment where you can go create a bunch of realistic-looking findings. So in GuardDuty, there is an option for sample findings, but it's just dummy data. Like the instances is I-111111, however, I think there's 9 characters. So that doesn't look that realistic. This will create the actual resources and then trip the findings so that you have realistic-looking resources. It is a big CDK project with a bunch of different resources. So maybe you want something more specific, and that's where we're going to start with our kind of first QDev demo. So the first thing that we built in here is a EKS GuardDuty demo. And for the record, when I started getting ready for this talk, I went to the QCLI and said, hey, I'm giving a talk at Inforce. I need to show off QDev. I need to show off GuardDuty, creating findings. Build me this repo. Hey, and then tell me what to do with it. So it even gave me like a demo summary, and it built different automations. So the first thing it gave me was a demo setup shell script that we'll get started with. Essentially what it's doing is making sure there's an EKS cluster that it can run these findings against, making sure that we have the context set, GuardDuty's turned on, a number of the things that we would need to make sure these findings get created. And then I'm blanking on the name of the file. So then we'll run the GuardDuty -EKS demo Python script. It says, are you ready to start your demo? Yes. Keep in mind, I did not code any of this. And if we go and look at the file, it's essentially a Python file. It did a bunch of the different comments so we know what it was doing. If we look at what it's doing, it's essentially creating a Kubernetes manifest file so it can do suspicious pod activity. I wanted to do these EKS findings since we just launched our EKS extended threat detection, and we can look at those findings. So if we look at what it's doing, it's saying it's executing suspicious kubectl commands. If you're not too familiar with kubectl, it's the Kubernetes command line utility that you can run commands in the Kubernetes environment via that utility. So it's getting secrets on all namespaces, getting pods, getting nodes associated with that. That might be like some sort of enumeration activity. And then it's execing into different pods. Execing is like a way to run the commands directly on the compute resource in the pod instead of against the Kubernetes control plane. So it set all this up for us so we could go create findings. And if we go further through the Python script that's creating these findings, we can see that it's creating malicious services. Services is just another concept through Kubernetes if you're not too familiar. Setting some of this stuff up for us, and then it's also kind of commenting where we're doing these different things and you can see the different print statements, and here's those suspicious commands that we saw earlier. Once again, I did not do any of this. So I'm gonna show an example in a minute of creating some of this, but if you just needed to create something quick and scrappy in your environment, you could just essentially give it a prompt and it would do that. And then it even asked me if I want to clean up these resources. I'm gonna say no for now. And then if we went over to the console, which I'm gonna pull up here, we can see the types of findings that it creates. So I'm gonna go to GuardDuty, go to findings. So EKS cluster inspector demo. It named it inspector demo because I was doing something else, but this is the one. We can see that 6 minutes ago it was last seen, but there is a Bitcoin related domain being queried from this instance. This is from a runtime monitoring agent that saw this activity. So this is the actual agent that is on the host for these EKS clusters. It uses an eBPF agent. It's getting telemetry, sending it back to GuardDuty. One of the things I said before was GuardDuty being easy to turn on. We collect that data. With agents, that introduces a little bit of complexity, but we use different use cases for enabling that, whether it's an EKS add-on, injecting a sidecar with Fargate, or using SSM to install the agent on an EC2 instance. We can still give that ease of deployment without customers, while we're introducing a runtime agent as well. Some of these findings do take a few minutes, so we're looking at findings that have already happened, FYI. So who's ever seen a attack sequence, extended threat detection finding, or is familiar with how those look? I know I talked about them a little bit earlier, but anybody? Yeah. Not talking about Binder. We can talk about that if you want. No, so these are the extended threat detection findings. So that finding we were just looking at was like a single thing. We've seen Bitcoin mining reaching out to, we've seen a known bad, an instance that is looking at a known bad Bitcoin mining domain, right? It's on an EKS cluster with what we introduced. This was originally introduced at reInvent last year. And then we've just been expanding to it. We launched it with an attack sequence finding for IAM credential compromise, and then S3 data compromise. And then what we launched yesterday was an EKS cluster compromise. And this is an example of that. And it's just bringing multiple things together. So, for example, these signals are the various findings that we had in this associated with this EKS cluster. So, for example, there was a phishing domain that was queried. So this is initial access. A drop point domain was queried as well. So it's more of an exfiltration type of activity. DGA or domain, I'm blanking, domain generated algorithm domain was queried. Command and control, and then kind of so on and so forth. So this is bringing essentially the different findings that were all part of the same security issue together, and then essentially bringing it all together so we can see that in one finding, versus you as a customer saying, oh, these all have a common instance together. These all have a common IAM role or actor associated with them. They're all probably part of the same issue. So bringing those different things together. All right, so that's essentially what the findings look like after the finding creation happens. If you do want to run the GuardDuty tester, the CDK deployment takes like 30 minutes, so I've actually already deployed it in this environment. But essentially the way that this looks is we'll go over. It deploys a number of EC2 instances associated with like Kali Linux and Windows and EKS to create the different finding types. But there is one instance that is labeled driver GuardDuty tester. I'm just going to get into this using Session Manager. And then let me get the command from here. It actually gives you the SSM command to just get to use SSM through the command line. So that's getting into the instance, the session manager. You can either do it through the console or through the command line. I'm just going to do it through the console for now. Change the directory, and then it's Python 3, GuardDuty tester -- help. And this will tell us the different examples of what we can do. So obviously help will tell us there's more stuff. We can declare that we want to test attack sequence findings. We can declare that we want to test EC2 findings, or ECS EC2, or ECS Fargate, or maybe if you're doing that tabletop exercise and you want to do like a specific type of finding to respond to, this will help you get a little bit more tailored to this. But for this scenario, we'll just do the attack sequence finding. Ooh. I definitely can't type when people are looking. Attack sequence. Oh, yep. And you got to use the right version of Python. And then one cool thing about this tester too is it will say like, do you want the tester to make changes on your behalf? So say for example, you're doing a Lambda finding, but you don't have Lambda protection enabled. It'll actually turn it on and then turn it off. One thing I would be sure to specify is each GuardDuty protection plan has a free trial. So if you're going to be doing this in a sandbox, it's probably fine, but I wouldn't possibly burn your free trial on a different account or something if you're not ready to. Cool. So the only one that actually exists in this one now, we're going to be extending this in the coming weeks, but is the S3 compromised data attack sequence finding. But it went ahead and ran that for you. If you actually go look at the code in the repo, you can see the different, I forgot where it is exactly. You can see the different, how they're creating these findings. All right, there we go. Stacks, common. Test resources, scenarios. Cool. So if you look at attack, S3 compromised data, you can go see what this is doing and how it's creating that finding. If, like, say, for example, once again, you didn't want to create all of these resources in your environment, this is, public GitHub repo that you could go, pull these commands off of and then replicate it in your environment as well, too. Cool, so that's enough on creating GuardDuty findings for now. Mm-hmm. I will hand it over to Pratima and we'll talk about responding to these findings.
So it wasn't all for nothing that Marshall went on about GuardDuty finding creation, because that's going to be critical. So what I've done is, and as soon as it shows up, we really have to pray to the demo gods for this thing to work, because I'm going to make an attempt to use the most recent kind of finding, which is attack sequences for EKS compromised clusters, which was announced yesterday. So I've prepared the demo. If everything didn't work, I will definitely show you what I've done in the past. But let's see this working. So now what I want to do is, say I've now, services keep releasing new features. This particular finding is new for GuardDuty. So what happens in your security operations function when there's a new finding type? You're going to go back and see, can I build an incident response playbook for this? So if you don't have context of what this finding is going to do, you can't build that framework, right? You can't build that incident response playbook, which is why the tester really helps, because you could just say, this is a GuardDuty finding, that is new, build something for me. So what I'm going to do now is I've prepared a few prompts, and I'm going to walk you through those prompts as we use Q. What Marshall showed you is Q developers integration within Visual Studio Code. I'm going to use baseline Q CLI on my terminal. Because like I said, I'm not a developer. I'm much better off. I used to do infrastructure as code, and I can do a lot of scripting. So terminal is my safest place to operate in, so that's where I'm going to be. If I just say Q chat, it's going to open up my console. And this Amazon Q integration is coming through my Identity Center integration with my AWS accounts. And you can see it says I'm chatting with Claude for Sonnet. But I could change, if I do a /model, I have a different option. Like, I have a few different options. By default, it uses 3.7. I've just upped it to 4 because I was curious. And that's about it. It's using 4. Now, let me go back. So you can see I have had a few attempts to doing this, right? So why do you think we need to make attempts at using GenAI models? Like, why doesn't it get it right in the first time? Or will it ever get it right every single time? What's that one thing about GenAI that we should always have at the back of our minds when we're using it? it's non-deterministic. What I talk to Q about today and what response it gives me will be completely different from me asking the same question tomorrow and the response that it will generate. And the fact that this is now using Identity Center and it has my context, it's sort of learning that this user had asked me about this thing, I gave it that response, but maybe I know better now, so I can give it a better response. So what I've asked it to do is, I have Amazon GuardDuty configured in my environment. GuardDuty findings are sent to AWS Security Hub for aggregation. And then I want you to build me a Security Hub custom action solution that will resolve a GuardDuty finding of the type attack sequence for compromised cluster. Now, nowhere am I giving it context of which cluster is compromised. I'm not giving it a specific finding. I'm just saying there's a new finding type. I want you to build me a baseline IR template for it. So I'm going to copy it and cross my fingers and paste it here. So let's see what it does. And like I said, documentation is not my thing. I would love to operate on infrastructure and tell customers, this thing stitches better, that is better for your solution. But if I had to write it in a doc, that'll take me longer than writing an email about, this is the best infrastructure. So now it's thinking. It's starting to think, what am I supposed to do? Let me create an architecture diagram. Let me see how I can build all of the components out. And while it's doing that, it's going back to the online resources that you have. Now, what it does is, because it's Amazon's models, or not models like Amazon's service, it has more context of AWS services, right? So it's able to pull, it's basically done its learning and training on AWS services as well. So it'll give you more contextual information. So you can see this is just the verbiage it has spat out. It said for EKS compromised cluster, this is the remediation architecture. You're going to send the GuardDuty finding to Security Hub, and then Security Custom Action is going to be based off of an event bridge rule. These are the remediation actions you got to take, and then SNS notification. So it's built out all of these components. It's in a pretty sort of document, and then it's given me the flow description as well. Now, as with any Gen AI model or any agentic workflow that you might be building, there are controls that you should be operating on. So usually they are safeguarded against writing onto your file system, because that's a potentially problematic thing if it happens in an environment where you don't want it to happen. So it's going to ask me whether I trust it or not. So if I say I trust it, if I put the T on, henceforth it's never going to ask me. But if I say yes, then every time it's going to write into a file, QCLI will ask me what to do. So now it's written out that markdown file, so it's written the architecture diagram. I also want it to write me infrastructure as code. So slowly, I'm building out that incident response template. So it'll keep thinking, because there's so many different pieces involved. It'll start looking at all of the things that are available, or the resources that are available for it through CloudFormation, and it'll start stitching it up together, and it'll produce me a YAML. Can I just go ahead and deploy that YAML in my account? I mean, I would love to, but I would want to make sure that it's right? It's doing the right thing. So what you can do in that case is, you can ask Q again, can you assert that all of the resources in this CloudFormation template are going to be deployed properly? So you're sort of reverse engineering and telling it, now you assert yourself whether you've done the right thing. Because what happened when I was building this demo was I tried to deploy the Lambda function that it had built, and it started failing on certain dependencies of Python. And I could be none the wiser, and it kept failing. So I had to continue to tell it, you're failing with this error. Can you improve? So it's a very interactive, it's like having a conversation with your peer and saying, you know what, this thing is not deploying. So you sit and do some troubleshooting, but here Q is doing it for you. Let me see if it ended up doing anything. But while it's thinking, if I go back to the document that it has created, it created me a markdown file, and I hope it's visible. And everything that you saw, it created pretty boxes, although the alignment is a bit wonky. But it's with just that much, you have built an incident response playbook. It may not have the commands there, but it's got the flow. So you could then extend on it and say, I keep going back to that agentic system, because a lot of the conversations these days are about agents and how you put it in the security operations function. If you had a security operations function or a platform that's driven with generative AI, you could use Q to build these architecture diagrams for each type of finding that GuardDuty has. So maybe weekly, just pull all the GuardDuty findings, build me out, or keep these updated. And as soon as it sees a type of finding with tangible data like business context, can you extend upon the finding that we already have and build me the remediation template for it? So it's taking a lot of time to think because it has a lot of things to do.
One thing to note too, while we wait on that, is the the trusting and allowing. If you look at the documentation, it'll tell you what's trusted by default. Really, the only thing is a file read, and then what are the different like components that you can either trust, deny, allow, and the actual like information that you might want to know of like what all is it really going to ask you. That's all in the QDev documentation. It's pretty straightforward. So something to potentially check out if you need to.
So now if you see, it's built me out a CloudFormation template. It's a massive template because it's doing all of those remediation steps. It's taking a few inputs, and these inputs can be provided through that event bridge integration, right? It's created an SNS topic because it said it's going to create one to do those notifications. It's talking about an IAM role for Lambda function, and it's kind of, it's named it as such so that you're aware of what's happening or why is this role being created. It's adding least privilege. Otherwise, it could have done Security Hub star, but it's not. So there's those security controls that it's providing out of the box. The one thing that I've observed with Q is even if you ask it to be, ditch all of the security controls, it tries to go back to building better security practices. So that's kind of a reinforcement function of, hey, let's not do anything stupid in our environment. So this is a massive template it has built. And for network isolation of EC2, for credential rotation of IAM, for CloudWatch logging, and it's starting to build the Lambda function as well. So it's using the right libraries, it's doing all of the imports. So it's basically doing all of that coding for you. And it's trying to make a separate Lambda function for better code organization. So now it's trying to improve itself. To say, well, this is the baseline I've built, use it if you like it. But I think that there's scope for improvement. So now it's thinking for you and doing that needful for you. And it's taking a bit of time because the EKS compromise cluster finding is massive. Let me show you the kind of finding that was generated. It's the same finding that Marshall had showed you. But if you see, did anyone attend the GuardDuty and MITRE session on Monday morning? So we talked specifically to attack sequences and how it ties up with MITRE. And why that's useful is because you're now, within GuardDuty, correlating that information to surface as a single thing. So when you think of remediation, Q is going into each of these bits, each of these individual findings that line up with certain type of MITRE attack tactic, and it's building remediation for each of them or quarantine for each of them, which is why it's taking longer. Now you see it's built out the Lambda function, and it says, there's something I can do to improve your experience, and I'm going to build out the Lambda function as well. Now I could go in and say, go in a loop and say, well, you know what, now I want you to write those tests. And it could go ahead and write those tests. So you can say, now I want you to go back and think what I'd asked you. Can you write tests to make sure that this thing is delivering on that? So there's a lot you can do with QDev that'll get QCLI, that'll get you started straight away.
Another thing too is if, like, say you wanted to stage this infrastructure in the account, that way you don't have to deploy it like when you want to do the remediation. Like you can also ask QDev to, if you have credentials local to this machine, like you're using an IAM role with temporary credentials that you're putting in the profile, you could essentially ask it to deploy this infrastructure as well, but not run it. So it's something that it can, do as well after you verify, like Pratima said.
Right. So it's going to think more, but I am very conscious of time. So I'm going to stop it at the point where it's built me the Lambda function for remediation, it's built me the CloudFormation template and the documentation. But this is all off of the back of a single finding type. What happens if I give it an actual finding of that same type? Now, I've tried it in 2 different ways, right? So I went ahead and I was, all starry-eyed with GenAI, and I told it, I'm going to tell you exactly what to do, build it out for me. And as deterministic and prescriptive as I become, the worse output I get from it. Because I'm not letting it think. I'm not letting it be creative and reach out to different sources and figure out what's the best way to do it. So I always got into this loop of, I'm telling you exactly what to do, why can't you build this? And it never works. So you need to keep a little bit of space open. So that first one, you see the attempt one that says, GuardDuty is configured a certain way. I'm telling you do this, do create a security hub automation rule. Do not create an automation rule, create a custom action, and it needs to be through Event Bridge. So I'm giving it very much, I'm basically teaching a child how to read without understanding the fact that the child can read, and I'm just wasting my time here. So instead of doing that, what I tried to do was, the second attempt I made, I asked it, you've already done this, right? You built that IR playbook. I want you to extend on that playbook based on a specific finding. So I've asked it to extend it. Now, because I'm using QCLI, and I've put a finding JSON, the finding that I just showed you, into a JSON template. This is how it'll appear as an event bridge, as an event through Event Bridge. And I'm going to tell it, hey, go back to that finding JSON, and I want you to build CloudFormation templates. Extend on the solution that you have just built. Now, because I'm in the same session, it has context of what it has just built. Now, if you were to look at this from the perspective of how can I operationalize it in my environment, you'd be looking at maybe Lambda functions triggering off that queue workflow, or maybe containers triggering off that queue workflow. You could have step machines or state functions, step functions doing this thing for you, and then committing it to source control. So you can keep extending it to say, and then you have version control access as well if you keep committing it to source control. Sorry, and now I'm going to say extend the solution based on GuardDuty finding in that directory, which is in context of where it's at. And you should build the related AWS CloudFormation templates to create resources needed to remediate this finding. Sorry. Write the files in the current working directory, so just don't assume any resource IDs. I'm providing everything through that JSON. So it's important for me to say it, because what happens is I don't want I don't want to confuse the model, because it is under the hood an agentic function. So if one of the agents is confused, it'll talk to the other agent, give more confusing information, and that confusion chain will continue to just not give me any output. And that's how you can just continue to fill up the context, and you'll have nothing productive coming out of it. So now it's going to say, OK, I'm going to do my thing. It's, again, going to take a lot of time. So it's going to examine that finding. Whoop. Sorry. Oh, well. There should be the file. OK. Let me see if it likes doing this. Whoop. Sorry, I've exited out of queue, and it's lost my. So what happens if you lose context? Now I've got all the files, right? I'm going to do some dirty operation here.
Something to point out here too, when Pratima got out of the chat and then went back into the chat, it still has context of what you were talking about. It'll store the context for a certain amount of time. I'm not too sure how long. And then it will also, if the conversation gets too long, it'll ask you if you want to compress the conversation to make it more responsive and stuff. So it is keeping track of that information. So if you exit out and need to repaste your temporary credentials or something and come back into it, you'll still have that context. Yeah. Yes, just so say you wanted to do something in AWS. It'll look for a profile related to the current user. And if you've given that permissions via a role, right, not an access or not a user, then yeah, it will assume those to do that action.
Right. So this particular prompt that I gave it, I told it to go into the prompt 1 folder where I had that sample IR playbook, and I asked it, now look into prompt 2 for that finding.json and extend the solution based on the information now I've provided, because now I have context of a specific finding. So it's going to continue building that CloudFormation template, but now it'll have specific resource IDs. So if I go back to the thing that it had created earlier, it didn't have the specific IDs. It was expecting them as inputs. Now here it'll create a bespoke YAML template that you can just, CloudFormation template that you can just deploy. So which means as a security operations function, you can have a battery of these IR playbooks, and you can stitch it in and say, well, if you see a GuardDuty finding of this type, and maybe you can play with the titling and stuff, then call the relevant or build the context or extend the solution that you've seen in that finding. It is going to take a bit of time, so I might just hand over to Marshall to go through the next one, and I'll connect back once it's done its thing, and I'll show you what it's built out.
So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about a different scenario. So before we talked about you're a security person, you are trying to create findings, trying to create runbooks, trying to respond to GuardDuty findings. Another scenario that somebody came up to me that I wanted to include into this talk was, let's think back to, I'm blanking on the time, but Log4j when it was like January.
December 2022.
December 2022, there we go. So it was a big thing that happened at the time, obviously, and I'm sure everybody in here was probably affected in one way or another. One thing would be cool that is from the developer persona is, hey, could I use this thing to help me remediate my Log4j vulnerabilities? Maybe you're using Inspector, and Inspector said, hey, this repository and this, these sets of resources have the Log4j vulnerability. Now you've handed it off to your developer, and you say, get after it. We need this done about tonight. So for this demonstration, I went into Q CLI, and I said, hey, create me a vulnerable Log4j application, which it will do for you pretty well. I'm going to go through a couple different ways that you can use Q in the IDE to interface with these repositories. So let me start a new chat. And I'm going to say, hey, tell me where in my current repo I have Log4j vulnerabilities. And then it's going to think for a second, help me scan where this is. This is the chat that's part of the IDE. So you can chat with it, tell it to look at like a specific repo. You can tell it to look at specific files in the repo. It's just another way to interface with the Q chat functionality, but directly from the repo. If we look at what it's doing, it says, hey, there's one. These are named pretty obviously, right? It essentially would start looking for like Java files and everything. One thing to point out is I can't write a single line of Java, so I asked it to comment, and we'll look at what some of these look like. So it said, hey, there's some directories here. There's a number of files, and we'll start looking for different Log4j vulnerabilities. And then we're looking for a pom.xml file in the root directory. And then it's also going to start looking at a number of other things. So let me pull up some of this as well. Cool. So now it's starting to do its analysis, and I'll scroll up in a second, but it's starting to find some of the Log4j vulnerabilities. I can see the locations in this demo original and this demo dupe file. Here's the CVE for this log for shell, critical severity. You're using Log4j version 2.14.1. It should be 2.17.1 or later. And here's the different affected files that we have, and then exploitation vectors, and then recommended fixes. So if we were to go back to this file structure, we can see the pom.xml file that it talked about. I also, when it created this, I don't know how to read Java or write it, so I was like, hey, can you comment and let me know where these problems exist so I can go find out about it? But essentially, you could also ask it to update the file with comments so that you understand where these things are at before you go fix them. And then you can see that here's this reference to 2.14.1, and it's saying, hey, look, you should do this. You should change this to 2.17.1. So another thing that you can do, we use the Q chat in the IDE. You can also highlight a line of code, and on a Mac, it's Command-I. So this is like inline suggestions, and you can say, fix this log4j vulnerability for me. So Q is generating an inline fix. It can, as you can see, the piece up top is red, the old code, and then green for the new code that it would do. And it's saying, do you want to accept or reject this? So I'm going to accept it. And now it has changed this for me. Like Pratima was doing, you can also use the Q chat. So let me. And then I'll use QChat to just change the rest, because maybe you change one line, but you're like, hey, look, I need to address all of these. So in the log4j vuln demo original, fix all of the log4j issues. Cool. So what it's going to do is it's going to start looking for those issues again, and then it's going to make those changes. Also, I think it'll already do it, but because a lot of times it essentially defaults to giving you like a summary of what it did or a markdown file associated with that. You could also say like, before you make any changes, let me know, or write down in a markdown file all the things that you're going to change, the suggested changes, the original issues, and it will write it all out for you. That way you can look at that before you tool validation. Oh, I'm in the wrong file structure, so maybe it's not going to find that. So let's look at this real quick. All right, so if you want to quit out of the chat. All right, and we're running out of time. So Q chat. And then let me do this again. Cool. So now it's in the right structure. If you saw before, I was still in the like GuardDuty folder, and it couldn't see. It would essentially had to go back in the file system to understand where that was. So now, perfect. I can see the vulnerability clearly. The project is using log4j 2.14. I didn't save the POM file, so it still sees it as broken. And now it's starting to read the rest of the files and understand what needs to be changed. And it'll essentially just keep going on and on. There's another validation error. One of the cool things that I found about QCLI is, especially when you're like deploying things to, say you're doing some test infrastructure and deploying, one of the things that when generative AI first came out and we had different just chats, you'd be like pasting over what it gave you, and then like it hit a different error, and then you'd go back over, and like maybe your prompt's not that good, so it doesn't get it 100% right, and then you go back. With the QCLI, it essentially will work through those issues for you. So like when I was doing some of the GuardDuty demos, it would say, hey, I accidentally missed something in my CloudFormation template. Let me change that and redeploy. And I was just sitting there, watching it go through the whole cycle and getting through those errors. So that was a much better experience than the whole Marshall copying, pasting over and over and continuing to run into the wall. So if you've not used the Q chat, it is absolutely a game changer.
If you could. So obviously if your IAM user is not provisioned to, let's say, like list findings, it'll run into an error based on your permissions. And then secondly, is there a self-hosted version of Amazon Q at all? Because it's scanning all of your files here, presumably looking for them, uploading that somewhere to think through it, and then like DLP concern.
Yeah, so you can specify what it can look through. So like in the, if you do like a /help, like QChat and then do /help, it will tell you like how you can scope down what it has access to look at. And I think in our documentation, if I remember reading correctly, it goes through like that scenario, right? Like you should not run this where you might potentially have sensitive information, because it will, if you tell it to look at a directory and the files in it, it's going to look at the directory and the files in it, right? So like there are certainly some security considerations to take into account there. So yeah, definitely look into that as well. Okay, so I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to hand this back over. But essentially, what's going to happen here is it's going to give me like a markdown with like, here's the things that I changed, here's the information that you need to know about these vulnerabilities and stuff. So it gives you like a really good write-up on what it did.
Now, if you think about EKS as an ecosystem, there's AWS resources, but Kubernetes itself is its own ecosystem, right? I've built an EKS platform in my previous job, and outside of understanding AWS, there was so many nitty-gritties of Kubernetes, namespaces, services, pod identities, control policies that we had to understand. So our like learning curve had to be steep, but had to be fast because we had to build all of that. And then incident response was just a whole different story because we were still understanding. So now I gave it one prompt that I showed you to extend on the solution. So it read all the files. It told me, hey, I've read all the files. I'm going to take everything slowly. First off, it built me a high-level architecture diagram. Now, it's using Mermaid for some reason, but in Markdown, it said, hey, this is the ingestion flow. We're going to see EKS runtime finding, DNS monitoring, network traffic analysis. In GuardDuty, they're all going to give us a finding aggregation in Security Hub, and I'm going to create a custom action. Now, this is the extension of that IR playbook that we had created. And then it spits out a diagram on remediation orchestration. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to build an event parser. It'll analyze the attack sequence, and then it'll build a forensics connector and everything else. And it also it realizes that it's talking about Kubernetes, right? So it also talks about what is the Kubernetes security layer that now I have to target. So it talks about network policies, RBAC policies, pod security policies, PSPs that you might deploy, and any other DNS filtering through Core DNS or any networking controls through Calico that you want to apply. And then it finally produces a data flow architecture. Like, this is the detection that has happened, and this is what we are going to be doing. The controls that it's going to implement. So these are all diagrams. It's just showing you slowly but surely, like, these are the things that I'm going to target. Because when you really look at the remediation, now you say it's titled enhanced, because I asked it to enhance the previous one. The enhanced module is looking for different aspects, but it's also looking for like a quarantine CIDR and a forensics S3 bucket. It realizes that I need to respond, and quarantining and forensics are a part of response. I didn't tell it I needed all of those things. So it's now started thinking as a security response person because it realizes I'm talking to it about security incident response. This is a massive template. So without scrolling it, the other thing that it also did was it created the Lambda function that will help me with the remediation, and it takes in all of the inputs that are being given through the CloudFormation template. But what it also does, it creates the Kubernetes constructs for the network policies, the PSPs, the IRSA policies, and they are ready to deploy. So because there's multiple layers in this ecosystem, and if it was only addressing the resource-based layers with AWS, the Kubernetes layers would be your problem or the developer team's problem or the product team, whoever is building it. But now it's consolidated everything. So now you've got constructs to deploy straight away into the Kubernetes cluster. That's going to help with remediation, with quarantining, with forensics. And finally, it's deployed security policies as well. That are there any security policies that are missing that need to be applied? And I didn't have to be very specific that give me all of this. It just figured that there's so many moving pieces. Let me bring it all together. Imagine the number of human hours that would have gone into this. And we've been able to do 4 different use cases in about under an hour. And then it spits out a README file, which I've taken you, sorry. It spits out a solution deployment file. Because now I've got so many moving pieces, how do I know which one to deploy when? Or what is ideal? So Q's been able to figure out, like, someone's going to need to do this orchestration, and it's done it for you. It's given me, hey, I'm going to check whether the CLI, I'm able to do what I need to do with AWS. I'm going to check if you're providing me the right parameters. I'm going to deploy the stack, so it's first deploying the remediation stack. And then it says, I'm going to update that Lambda code because I feel like we could do a better job, and we were maybe constrained by the number of characters in that CloudFormation template. And then it says, once I've deployed that, I'm going to extract the finding parameters, and I'm going to push it through the Kubernetes stack the Kubernetes resources that it had pulled. And then it'll deploy the Kubernetes manifests, which included network-based controls, pod security policy-based controls. And then finally, it's going to display a summary of, this is what I've done so far, these are the different things I've applied, and these are the different stacks. So I've basically had to build nothing. Now, I could be deploying this in my AWS account, and maybe some bits of it fail. But I can go back to Q and say, I'm getting this error in this particular module. Fix it for me. So I'm not having to do that introspection myself. So I could, it feels a bit tedious, but what would be better than something like Q solving it for you, or you Googling 100 different pages and then trying to figure out which one stitches better. So this is your kickstart into using generative AI for incident response. And obviously, you can then do better with agentic AIs and agentic SOCs and all the different capabilities that you can do with other types of capabilities like strands agents and MCPs and stuff. That's more or less everything from my side, unless there are any questions, and we are pretty much on time at this point. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being interactive. And if you like this session, or if you would like something more from this session, please give us feedback on the app, and we would love to hear from you.